Michael, I'd like to welcome you and also thank you on behalf of the K-Lab editorial team for accepting to have this interview with us. It's really great to have you here. There is definitely a wide array of topics that we would like to discuss with you, but we'll try to narrow it down as much as possible to the essentials. Now, most of us do know you from your infamous blog, thenextrecession.wordpress.com, where in that blog, but also in your books, which sadly haven't been translated in Greek yet, you analyze the world economy from a Marxist perspective, putting the emphasis mostly on the Marxist theory of crisis, but at the same time, you touch upon different subject areas, including climate crisis, imperialist rivalries, political developments of all sorts across the world. And I must say that over the years, you have provided us with very useful insights on all of the above, helping us, to get our heads around what's happening in the world in a way that's also helping us in our day-to-day struggle, thus fulfilling what Marx was saying, that theory must not only explain the world, but it must also serve as a means to change the world. Now, before we go on, would you like to give us a background on how you came to write about all that, and also if you want an update on what we shall expect from you in the near future?
Well, Alex, I think your first question was, how did I come to get to this work that I've done? I was working mainly as an economist. I was trained as an economist at university, then worked professionally as an economist in a various range of financial institutions, banks, and other investment research organizations. So I was in the heart of the enemy, working in finance capital. Many people ask me when I have these sorts of discussions, how can you work in the finance capital and in banks and so on when you want to be a Marxist and you want to overthrow finance capital and replace it with a socialist system? There are two answers to that. The first answer is I might be schizophrenic and therefore need medical treatment. Or the other is that obviously it provides me with a high degree of information and clarity about what capitalism in its bowels does, what its strategy is, and so on, what it wants to achieve. Just take the example of the current pandemic crisis. In the course of the last few months, in various financial circles, and I've been hearing it, there is often the line put that this pandemic is a waste of time, it's only killing old and sick people, and that productive young people like yourself and so on are fine, and we want to get those people back to work, and if the old and the sick die, that's just how it goes, and at least everybody will be immune and capitalism can restore itself to normality. And that attitude which actually goes back nearly over 200 years to the time of Thomas Malthus, one of the early classical economists, who argued that there was too many poor people in the world, and so we had to have regular culling of them in order to get productivity up and the economy going. That idea still holds in financial circles, I have to tell you. It's a shocking thought, but there it is. As far as they're concerned, profit stands before humanity, and that's why we see just in the last few days and weeks, big efforts to reopen the economy in the US and other countries because it is destroying the capitalist mode of production and profit. So I think I can gain a lot of insight into that. But at the same time, I have developed since I was your age, a Marxist and socialist view, and I've always held to that. So I've tried to apply my understanding of the world economy, apply to that Marxist theory of value, Marxist theory of crisis, in order to understand what's going on. And in the latter part of my career in the finance world, I started to work on some serious books from a Marxist point of view. I wrote a book, Alex, in 2009, and it was written really before that, looking at the likelihood of a Great Recession and what happened in that Great Recession. And then, as you say, I followed it up with some other books. In 2016, a book about the Long Depression, which is the period of the last 10 years, as I call it, when it's been very slow and weak. And so, and now looking also at Marxist theory, with the relevance of that Marxist theory in the last 200 years. So I think I'm trying to offer both an understanding of what finance capital is up to, and also a theoretical explanation from Marx's point of view. So that's how I've reached this point of view, at a very old age now. So time is running out, and I need to get the input of young people in this so that we can progress our understanding. So the purpose of my exercise is to understand what is going on in the capitalist mode of production and the world economy. The more we understand, the more, as you say, we can correctly apply action and practice to solving how to go about solving the problem of removing the capitalist system and its mode of production and replacing it with a socialized system in common ownership throughout the world, where human beings cooperate and not fight or drive just for the individual interest of profit. So the whole point about Marx's economic theory is to understand the nature of capitalism in the most scientific way, not just because it's horrible, but to also understand what are its flaws, its failures, and why it cannot possibly be a system that can last forever for humanity.
Yeah, Michael, I must say that I totally concur that action starts from understanding. And in that sense, we will try to use this interview as a means for us to understand more what's going on around us. It's true that although we're in a lockdown and it seems that physically we're not doing much, there is actually there are a lot of things that are happening right now in the world. So we would appreciate your input in different aspects of the conjuncture so that we can reach a better understanding. And it's a very good coincidence that you started from by referring to what you call the Malthusian moment, the Malthusian strategy, because we would also like to start the discussion from the response of different capitalist states to the current pandemic. Now, the thing is that despite of all the talk about globalization, about a deeper political integration last years, we think that the COVID-19 crisis has really made it clear that our world remains as fragmented as ever. So there's been nothing close to a globally or even regionally coordinated response to the pandemic. We've just seen the emergence of different national strategies, and strategies that really vary widely between them in terms both of the means they implement, but also in their scope, in what they're trying to achieve. It's not the same for every country. So I guess that now that we're into this for almost 3 to 4 months, and I'm only guessing that there should be sufficient data, what are your thoughts with regards to those different strategies and their efficiency in containing the virus?
Well, the first thing to say, of course, this is a new virus. And that's perhaps the most important thing for us to remember, to start with, is that we appear, that is humanity, appears to be now facing a series of new pathogens, new killing viruses and bacteria that we've not experienced before in human civilization for hundreds of years, since perhaps the plagues of the 14th, 15th and 16th century. And these new pathogens, it seems, are coming into humanity's bodies because of the closest that human beings are getting to the most extreme parts of wilderness in the world. The massive drive of industrialization around the world, in the drive by capital for profit, and not just industrialization, but urbanization and the turning of the wilderness into agricultural, industrial agricultural land has meant that we've seen a tremendous move of destroying species and wildlife to the point of the extremes. And as a result, human beings are now, through logging, through mining, through fossil fuel drilling, and all kinds of other processes to extract energy and other resources from nature, we've now come close to a whole range of nasty pathogens, which wildlife has had for thousands of years, but now it seems that they've been able to trip through maybe other animals but into the food chain of human beings, and this has led to these viruses like coronaviruses. We've had others, SARS and others, swine fever and so on, which are now affecting human beings. And this is, if you like, a new process. Like climate change, it's now been added to us, the real danger of pandemics. And I have to say this was coming. The first thing to say is that it appears that capitalism was not prepared to recognize that this was going to come. I'll see if I can get my act going here and show you something. If it works, no, it's not going to. Now we'll try again. But you can see on this one that pandemics have been warned about by the scientists for some time. This is a global UN body called, does an annual report called World at Risk, and only last September they were saying that there was a very good chance of a pandemic hitting the world, and yet nobody seemed to be willing to take responsibility for stopping this. And how could it be stopped? Well, there are a number of ways which we can discuss, but it's worth considering what the attitude was of world leaders like Donald Trump, who you know well said in early February that this virus is no more than a flu and that it will disappear by itself, and it was all very much under control. At one point he said there were just 11 cases in the whole of the US, and so he had nothing to worry about. And now, of course, as of today, there are 820,000 cases in the US and 46,000 deaths already. So clearly this pandemic was ignored, and also there was no preparation for it. Now, it seemed what could have avoided the situation where nearly 3 billion people are locked down in socialization in various forms, and there's a closure of up to 50% of world production as a result. What could have avoided that and yet keep in control of this virus and dealing with it? Well, I think the evidence shows, Alex, after several months of looking at this, that if there had been a fully applied mass testing of human beings immediately, this virus became clear, so you could test, trace where people were infected, contact their contacts so that they were quarantined for the 14-day period, which appears to be necessary, that through mass testing and tracing of contacts, you could drastically reduce the ability of the virus to spread through cities and countries. But no country, including China, had that mass testing facility available. The second thing is that you needed a very high level of capacity for the health systems of the world to cope with a sudden surge of people who needed to be hospitalized and looked after. But because most health systems have been drastically cut over the last 10 years in particular, but before that, particularly in the West, in Europe and the United States, testing is very low, as you can see in this chart. If you go down the bottom of the left-hand side, for example, where I am in the UK, testing levels are pathetically low. And they were also in China as well. Only some small countries and Scandinavia had high testing. Beds were incredibly low. Available hospital beds were very low. If you look at the bottom of that list, there's Sweden, UK is down there. Greece is a third of the way up. And then you can see countries like Germany are near the top, which I think explains a lot, because if you've got mass testing available, because there's no vaccine, unlike influenza at the moment, mass testing, plus good hospital facilities and staff ready to deal with this with the right equipment, then there could have been a dramatic reduction in the infection. But because that didn't exist, and because governments like the US government and most European governments didn't take this seriously to begin with, our own Prime Minister in the UK was still shaking everybody's hands and going around to mass football matches and things like that, rather than dealing with this. And as a result, the infection started to spread and kill people. And the only option then was a complete lockdown, which is what governments have been forced to resort to. And that has led to huge increases in deaths per million of population now. You can see that Spain and Italy have suffered the most, France and the UK behind, Sweden and Netherlands catching up. And this is a movable feast because every day there's more deaths, so that this figure will increase over the next few months as we go. In fact, I can show you that in the most likely position at the beginning of, by the time we get to August, when the big curve of peak has peaked and started to fall, you can see that countries like Belgium and Sweden in Europe are going to be leading the way in terms of deaths. That's the sort of maximum level of deaths per million that we would like to have achieved. But you can see down the other end, Germany and Greece. Germany is very low because it had all the health facilities, beds and position. It was able to test hugely as well and contact and trace, but it also applied a lockdown. And in the case of Greece and some other countries like New Zealand, they locked down immediately from almost day one when there was the first signs that they were going to get the infection. While countries like Italy and Spain left it too late because they didn't know what was going to hit them and so on. China was able to turn things around within 2 weeks by the most draconian measures of lockdown where everybody could hardly move, at least in the province of Hubei, in order to reduce the effect of the virus. So the first thing you'd say about this coronavirus is it shows two things, that there's serious pandemics, we're going to see more of them, or pathogens, because of capitalism's drive into the world for profit and into nature and the destruction of nature. And also that basically most capitalist governments are unable to cope with this. The market economy cannot cope with this. They dramatically reduce the health system so they're not in a position to defend and protect people's lives. They're at the maximum or usage or at the minimum level of facility in order to meet this. So that's two major lessons you've learned from this. And that is why the lockdowns have taken place. I just finished on this point, Alex, which is interesting. There's quite a lot of Twitter and Facebook stuff and other things going around and saying, well, you know, this lockdown is pointless because this virus isn't really that dangerous. And if we just let the population get infected, so most of the young people were infected and the old people were quarantined, then there would be, in the end, we wouldn't need the lockdown at all. Sweden is sort of adopting this policy, and you can see in the graph I'm showing now that the forecast for Sweden's death rate is to surpass all the others as a result of having only a very light lockdown, no testing in Sweden, not many beds, but they're just relying on everybody getting infected, and in that way, later on in the year, everybody will be immune. But will they be immune? Will the vaccine come? Will they enter another wave after this? That remains to be seen. This is a very dangerous policy which the Swedish government is adopting, as opposed to the most draconian measures being adopted by countries in the past like China and eventually Spain, Italy, and to some extent the UK. As you say, Alex, it's a varying degree of response in terms of the lockdown and a varying degree of capability amongst the capitalist governments. But most of them have totally failed to be able to protect human beings and their citizens from this pandemic.
Yeah. Well, from the numbers you're showing, it seems that, you know, any thought about this herd immunity strategy is proven from the facts to be totally wrong. So at least it seems as good news that the UK did a U-turn on that thing, but apparently it also seems that this U-turn was taken very late.
Yes.
So there were crucial weeks lost, but I think that's the case not only in the UK, that's the case also in other countries, mostly in Europe, in the original epicenters in Italy, Spain, and so on. However,
I think we could say that if all these countries had testing facilities, decent hospital facilities, and opted straight away when the virus appeared, they could have a result more like Germany than they're getting at the moment.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point, but I mean, looking at those numbers, one cannot avoid thinking that, you know, there's a striking difference between what Germany did and what happened or what happens in Italy or Spain. And, you know, it comes naturally to kind of make the connection between that and the fact that, you know, austerity as the norm, especially in the European South, has kind of framed our response against the pandemic. So do you agree that for the countries of the European South, be it Italy, Spain, and also Greece for that matter, the pandemic was dealt with as a public finance crisis, leaving practically only quarantine as an option, whereas for Germany, that was not the case.
I think that's right, Alex. Yeah. I mean, Greece figures there look great. If you like to, we're talking about less deaths, that's all. But and the answer there is that Greece has applied, as far as I know, you can tell me better, a very severe lockdown. And also, it seems that because you're an island nation or a many island nation, it's a little bit more difficult for the virus to get around compared to the huge concentrations of land urbanization in some other countries. But if you take Greece out and then just look at Germany against the others in Europe, your argument is absolutely right. The less there has been in cuts in the public health system and public services in general, the more governments have been able to handle this pandemic. The more cuts, the more serious has been the result. And that applies across the board, I think, internationally, and it's one of the results, one of the lessons that we're learning from this. I mean, there have been massive cuts in the public health systems, including in Greece. I was just looking at the figures before we had this interview, as of course, one of the biggest things that's happened in Greece has been the slashing of the health system. And perhaps when we get a little bit more down in this discussion, we can look at that again. But it seems to me that Greece had no alternative to go to straight lockdown because of that. And the other countries who didn't operate a straight lockdown straight away are in the mess that they're in now. Some countries who did have good facilities, like South Korea and Germany, were able to combine that with a lockdown to keep their rates down. In the case of New Zealand, which is again a small island with a low population, they had a most draconian lockdown from day one, and they have been able to control the pandemic. But on the whole, the result has been, as you exactly say, not enough health system capacity, not enough action on the part of the government quick enough, and the result is they've been forced into really a catastrophic lockdown of the world economy, which is killing capitalism. This virus is killing capitalism. It cannot go on much longer. Capitalism has to be revived, even if it means at the expense of people's lives. And that's going to be the pressure now from big business and from the finance sectors. Let's get back to normal. Let's get back to business as usual and take our chances with how many people die over the next 6 months or a year.
So you reckon that we may have avoided this Malthusian moment so far, but that doesn't mean that it's off the table, is it?
Well, I was just looking today at a couple of studies which were saying that the test and tracing, where it's been done in close studies and looking at infections and so on, they're estimating that probably at the maximum 15–20% of the population in various countries, it varies, have actually been infected. So people like yourself who probably won't have any symptoms, asymptomatic, have been infected, but maybe because of the efforts of the lockdown, only 15 to 20% have. I mean, this is, nobody knows for sure, but that means if the lockdown comes off, there's still many, many people who can then get infected and die. And that includes the people who are most vulnerable, which are the sick, people with existing medical conditions, people who are old, over 70 in particular, people who smoke and drink a lot, all those sorts of things, people who are obese, all those people are likely to be most vulnerable to severe illness and death. One point I would make, by the way, that this virus turns out to be not like flu once you recover from it. If you've had a severe illness as a result of the virus, you could be in hospital for 3 or 4 weeks, not just a few days like influenza people are. And also people are left with lasting scars on their lungs, it now seems. So people have respiratory problems which they may not get rid of over in the future. So this is a much more severe virus than those who think we can just let things go and it'll be like a flu, and most people won't have any symptoms, and anyway, everybody's already infected. Well, I think so far the studies show nothing like that to be the case.
Okay, yeah. So if you're okay with that, I was thinking that maybe...
This is biology and medicine, my field, so I'm taking a chance when I say these things, but there we are.
Well, if I may say, well, you are one of the few economists that have also touched upon this pandemic, let alone Marxist economics. I mean, I'm also talking about people from, from other mainstream media. A lot of them are focusing on the economic downturn, but you've done a great job in monitoring the public health crisis real close. So yeah, I think that's very, very good of you, and I think that all those insights that you've shared so far, they're really, really helpful for us. So if you're okay with that, I was thinking that maybe we could move on now to the, let's say, to the economic aspect of the current crisis. And in the same fashion that you are talking about the coronavirus as a pandemic in the making for quite a long time now, it's true that the current economic downturn is also was kind of heading our way for quite a long time now, irrespective of the coronavirus and the ensuing lockdown, or actually irrespective of any external shock for that matter. So would you like to take some time and walk us through the fundamentals of Marxist theory of crisis and how those apply to what we're seeing in the world today?
Well, yes, first, a lot of people would say that this is an exogenous shock. In other words, it's something like an asteroid hitting the Earth, or some sort of flood, or something which you couldn't have expected. It was an unknown, to use the phrase of Donald Rumsfeld back in the Iraqi war. It's something you couldn't possibly expect, and therefore it's nothing to do with the mode of production, the social relations, and the activity of the capitalist mode of production. Well, as we've already discussed, because of capitalist drive into all parts of the world and into agriculture, to wildlife, that's what's provoked these pathogens. So in that sense, it's not an accident, it's not an exogenous shock. However, I suppose you could say it does start off as a huge, the lockdowns have caused a massive shock to the supply system of the capitalist economies around the world, and now anything up to 50% of workforces are being made redundant. Billions are being forced back into poverty in the so-called developing world. This is a major slump that is about to hit us and has hit us and will last, well, we could discuss how long, even if the lockdowns come off, how long this slump will last, but it is a major one, the first one we've seen for 10 years. Now, in Marxist theory, the Marxist economic theory is that capitalism is not a harmonious system of production invests, provides everybody with wages and livelihood on an equal basis and in a harmonious, progressive way, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. In fact, it's a system that is volatile, it is liable to collapse and recovery, collapse and recovery. A cycle of boom and slump is the very nature of its process of production. It's uneven in its development. Some people get more than other people. Some countries do better than other countries. It's a very uneven process because it's a drive on the basis of competition between capitals and the exploitation of the workers of those capitals. And it's also competition between countries, between big, powerful imperialist countries trying to rule the roost over weaker capitalist economies. So it is not a system of harmony, progress and cooperation, quite the opposite. Therefore, it is that's the basis of looking at why those economies can have crises on a regular basis. But if we analyze more deeply what is the cause of those regular crises, then the simple answer is it depends on whether capitalists are making enough profit or not. It's a very simple question. So if profits for capitalism starts to decline, capitalists start to get less profit, then they will invest less, they will employ less, and if some companies, even big ones, don't make any profit at all, start making loss and collapse, that will lead to the laying off of those workers, the closure of that company, and that could cascade through the whole economy and cause a slump. Then when enough companies have been swept aside, have been re-merged and concentrated, and enough workers have been sacked so that profits per production now look stronger, profitability rises, then you get a recovery of capitalism. So the idea is a boom and slump depends on the movement and change in the profitability of capital on an average basis in a country and internationally. And if I show you this next graph, you'll see that this is a measure in the G7 capitalist economies of the profitability of capital over the last 60, 70 years, since the Second World War, more or less. And you can see in the first period, where the dotted line is, that there's quite a high level of profitability. When there's a high level of profitability and even rising profitability in these economies, on average, for these capitalist companies, then employment is high, wages can increase, and there's a faster growth and investment and productivity. But if profitability should come crashing down, as it did in the period between the late 1960s to the early 1980s, a most significant fall in the profitability on average of the G7 economies, then you get a situation of crisis for capitalism. There are continual slumps, workers are being laid off, attempts are made to try and keep the economy going, you get inflation, you get a combination of both inflation and collapse in production and higher unemployment. If you can get enough reduction in the employment and you can get rid of a lot of older industry, perhaps you can export your capital abroad where the labor is cheaper, then you can crush trade unions so they can't ask for more wages. You can privatize sectors of the state to make them more profitable for the private sector. Then you can get perhaps a recovery in the rate of profit. And that's what we saw in the so-called neoliberal recovery. Academics like this word neoliberal. It's just a recovery in profitability caused by the ability of capitalism to turn things around. But mainly slumps do this job. The 1980 slump, 1990 slump as well, drove up profitability for a while, but it cannot last forever. That's the argument of Marxist economic theory. Eventually profitability will begin to fall again. We could perhaps discuss why that can happen. We'll see how much we can go, but then it will start to fall, and we then enter a period of falling profitability again, which is what we've seen really in the 21st century. Apart from little upturns caused by a driving of interest rates to zero or pumping in money by the central banks and so on, the rate of profit on the whole has generally been declining and is really at a low level compared to where it was in the golden age. And after the slump of 2008-9, which you can see on the right-hand part of that graph was quite sharp. The recovery since then has been more like a square root, not a V. It's got up and then it started to flatten out and so on. And just as we get to the coronavirus, we find that if we look at the profits as a whole, globally, and not profitability, but global profits in total, that actually they were going back into negative territory. Profits were falling. And so at the beginning of 2020, we were very likely heading into a global slump or recession anyway. So several economies were already in that: Japan, Mexico, Argentina, South Africa. Others were close to recession as well, like Italy and so on. And even Greece, which supposedly had a recovery from 2017, was again beginning to slow down and looking in difficulties, despite the hopes of the new Conservative government. So a slump was coming anyway. And in a way, the coronavirus was just that tipping point that shook the capitalist economy into a slump, but one which was obviously partly artificially created by the lockdown, but also because they had to deal dramatically with a sharp reduction in production and trade around the world as everybody closed their borders and everybody tried to avoid the impact of the pandemic. So my view, Alex, is that capitalism has continued crises. They can't get out of them. We need, if you want to understand whether there's going to be one and how it's going to come, then you have to look at what's happening with the profitability of capital above all. Other people have other theories about causal crises, including Marxists. This theory on profitability isn't the only one. If you read the great Marxists of the time, not all of them agreed that profitability is the one to look for. Some people look at the inability of workers to get more wages, and because they can't buy everything, that causes slumps. Other people say it's due to the uneven development, disproportion in capitalism. So there are different theories. And of course, the mainstream theory is that there are no crises in capitalism. Everything is sort of a shock, which we can then sort out later on. It's a mistake, it's bad policy, or it's something goes wrong with regulation. It's not to do with anything inherent in the capitalist system. So if we're discussing the pandemic, we're also discussing the fact that the pandemic is become part of what the continual likelihood of crises in capitalism as they appear, and they have done for the last 200 years, and certainly since Marx wrote Capital and talked about those things in the middle of the 19th century.
Yeah. Well, I guess that a discussion on the different Marxist theories of, a discussion on the different theories within Marxist cycles about capitalist crisis would merit a discussion of its own.
Definitely.
Probably. We may have that discussion in the future. Probably this recession is going to be with us for quite a while as well. However, I would like to touch upon some issues that I think are of great importance for us now. The first one is that with regards to Europe and the Eurozone, we've seen that the current crisis has revived this discussion about the ability of the countries that use the euro as the currency to take up more debt collectively, not as separate countries, but as a group of countries. Is what they call the euro bond, or how it's called now, the Corona bond.
Yes, now it's a Corona bond. Yeah.
Yeah. I would like your view on whether you think that this is actually going to make a difference, whether the Corona bond is going to make a difference. And I'm asking that bearing in mind that, as you've consistently pointed out in your blog, and as you also mentioned before, we also saw that in the previous recession in 2008, 2009, or in Europe, we saw the same thing, but with some 2 to 3 years lagging, that the fact that the main response from the capitalist system was for central banks to start pumping money into the economy But as you said, by doing so and not doing something to restore profitability, all you do is bring the horse to the water, but not forcing it to drink. So my question is, are we just witnessing a replay of the previous crisis? Are they doing, as they are allegedly saying that, are they doing whatever it takes to restore the capitalist, or is it just another example of just kicking the problem into the future and therefore expecting another recession in, I don't know, 4 to 5 years time at some point in the future?
Well, I think that the reaction of most governments in Europe, the United States and elsewhere, capitalist governments, is basically what they tried in 2008-9. They are trying to massively inject money and credit into the financial system, mainly into the banks, but also now directly into big business, and to some extent even into households by writing checks out for people to have some cash while they're locked down or unemployed or laid off by their companies. So we see in this graph a massive increase in the amount of money being printed. Obviously, money isn't printed anymore in notes, but the movement of accounts by the central bank into the government's accounts and into the accounts of banks, commercial banks, directly by an accounting measure, it's a huge increase. And this is all the different central banks, and the sort of percentage of GDP you can see there on the right-hand side is something like 5 trillion, $6 trillion, or something like 5 to 6% of world GDP just from those central banks is being shoved into the banks and into governments in order to allow them to spend or to keep companies going or keep themselves going. And this is a process which they did in 2008, but as you can see, it's way, way higher this time because of the severity of this slump and the damage it's causing. Same, I did a calculation of the government spending increases, packages for households, but mainly for big business, mainly for businesses in general to keep them going during what they hope is just a 3-month lockdown. And you can see that on average, there's been a 5% of GDP, 4 to 5% GDP increase in government spending after all the years of austerity, 10 years of austerity we've had in particular since the last recession. Now we have a massive increase in government spending. These are the only 2 weapons available to capitalism. That 5% or 4% is double what was eventually spent in the Great Recession. They're hoping, of course, that this is just going to be a short, sharp shock, and that within a couple of quarters of the year, by the end of this year, the pandemic will be over, economies will be motoring again, and then comes the issue of how all this is going to be paid for. And there are 3 options open to the capitalist governments. They can start taxing people higher to get some of this money back. They can just keep on spending, just let inflation ride so that these debts are written off by inflation, which in effect means that as inflation rises, working people are going to suffer in their real wages because of higher inflation. Or they could attempt to liquidate this, but then that could probably cause another slump. And of course, they could cut back all the government spending they've made. So those are the weapons they have. And the reason those weapons, in my view, won't work is the same as they happened in the Great Recession, that they applied these measures, but did they restore the capitalist economy to the sort of growth rates of investment, productivity, and general national output, and therefore people's wages as a result after the use of these methods? Well, no, because between 2009, 2010 and now, real GDP growth in most economies has been lower than it was in the previous 10 years before that. And the previous 10 years before that, it was even faster. So we've seen a gradual decline in real GDP growth. Investment growth has also been weak. investment to GDP in most capitalist economies in the private sector is lower than it was before 2009, and even worse, the public sector investment to a GDP has been slashed dramatically, so there's no support from government investment either. And productivity has really been appalling in most capitalist economies. I mean, Greece, of course, is an extreme example because of what happened to it. But you can see here, if you look on the left-hand side, that's Greece's GDP. It was $300 billion back in 2010. And before this pandemic broke out, it's dropped to something like 220. So we've had a massive reduction in GDP. On the right-hand side, that's investment in dollars for the Greek economy, down from 2010 and just completely flat for the last 5 or 6 years. Even the so-called recovery in 2017 has not been in investment. Per capita GDP, again, you can see a big gap on the left-hand side. And that's the productivity performance of Greece since 2010.
It doesn't make for a good read, does it?
It's just appalling. It's down by something like 10%. And I can say that's actual fall in the productivity of the Greek economy. In most other capitalist economies, there's been some growth, but it is incredibly weak and shows you how if Greece as a capitalist economy, after going through this major crisis and slump and draconian measures imposed by the Eurozone leaders in order to make it a proper capitalist economy, it hasn't succeeded in doing so because the profitability of Greek capital has not recovered despite all these measures, either of austerity or of pumping in money. Government spending slashed by something 40% since 2010 in order to help the private sector, but again, that has failed. And the health system weak. And very latest figures from the IMF suggest with this pandemic, the Greek public sector debt, which has been a record high of 180%, supposedly all this was to get the public sector debt down, and yet it's exactly where it was 10 years ago or worse. And now the pandemic will take it up to 200% of GDP, and that's being optimistic in the course of the next couple of years. So, and Greece is the extreme example in Europe, but it applies to Italy almost as much, a much bigger economy, much more important to the European economy, but it also applies across the board for capitalism. So the policies of monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, and then taking it all back with austerity once the economy is supposedly recovered, both of them fail because they don't, the question is what is happening to the profitability of capital, and as we showed you in the previous graph, they've not been able to turn around the profitability of capital despite the slump of 2009, despite these stimulus measures, and now the pandemic is driving us into another leg in this long depression. I suppose the question we would then ask, will we have a big enough slump that maybe they will get profitability up in the next period? Yeah. And that's an issue which I'm not sure about myself, but I think it's still unlikely that the pumping in of this money, which has restored the stock market to some extent, the stock market, if I give your board a view that before the pandemic started, the stock market was hitting 3,200 on the S&P index, which is the American stock market, 3,200. That was a record high. In the period when the economies were already beginning to go down, the stock market was stimulated by zero interest rates and still plenty of money coming from the Fed. Then it slumped in this pandemic to 2,200, so that's a massive fall. It's back this evening to just under 2,900, so it's gone all the way back. So what this Federal Reserve and other central bank stimulus has done is restore the stock market. It's made the finance sector feel more comfortable, and they're happy. They're getting all this free money to keep their businesses going, and they're looking, as it were, over the valley of this slump to have business as usual in a year or so's time. Well, I think we're going to be sadly shocked by the fact that's not going to happen, and that these stimulus policies will work. I'll finish on this point, Alex, on this question. A lot of left economists think that Federal Reserve and central bank stimulus, monetary stimulus, and fiscal deficits and government spending work. This comes from the economics of John Maynard Keynes in the Great Depression and afterwards, that they said if the government spends money, it can create the conditions by which there'll be more demand. That more demand for all sorts of goods will lead to capitalists being able to sell more, then they'll be able to take workers back into employment and production will go forward and investment will start again. What was called pump priming the economy by the government intervening by spending money. And then those deficits that the government creates would be worked off because production would increase and so on, everything would be resolved. The point of the Keynesian view was what mattered was re-establishing demand. The difference between the Keynesian view and the Marxist view is no, what matters for capitalism is not re-establishing demand, it is whether it's profitable to make an investment, whether it's profitable to start selling more. And if profitability doesn't rise, despite government spending money, then there will be no real recovery in the capitalist economy. And that proved to be the case in the last 10 years. So in my view, Keynesian policies, there is a economic empirical way of looking at it. It's called the Keynesian multiplier. In other words, how much growth do you get out of every 1% of GDP government spending? And if you get 1% growth out of 1% of increase in government spending, that's a multiplier of 1. Anything less than that makes it really rather not worthwhile. And in fact, the historic evidence shows that Keynesian multiplier has been pretty much a failure in restoring growth. We had Mino Carcadi and I, which is another Italian Marxist economist, came up with a Marxist multiplier, which is, so let's measure the increase in profitability against growth. And you find a much higher correlation and a much higher multiplier. So capitalist sector can get its profitability up, then they'll invest and then there'll be growth. But at the moment, I don't see that possibility happening. Therefore, the capitalist system is not going to deliver a return to growth. We're going to see a lower level of growth, even than we had in the last 10 years, and a much higher level of unemployment, and wages are going to be restricted, and the governments are going to be in difficulty in trying to recoup all this spending that they've imposed now.
Well, since you mentioned the Keynesian multiplier, may I say that in Greece we do have kind of a really bad experience from multipliers, because that was the assumption of the IMF, you know, the infamous assumption, and then the acceptance of the mistake on behalf of the IMF that we just got the multiplier wrong. But if we've gotten it right, then everything would have worked out great.
Well, the thing I remember during the crisis, the debt crisis, I was participating in a mainstream finance seminar, and it was called by a Professor Pissarides in the London School of Economics, who was a Nobel Prize winner, important mainstream economist, another quite important economist. By the way, after this meeting, I was never invited again. But at that meeting, we had a video conference with who eventually became the finance minister for Syriza, Sakalotos, who I think is still their spokesman on finance at the moment. And in that meeting, he said the most important thing was to have sufficient fiscal space so that the government could spend more to get us out of this crisis. Whether that was fiscal space is a trendy word for saying if we can get more taxes out of people and if we can get some funding from somewhere else, borrow money, then we've got room to spend. And that's what we have to have. If we can't get those things, then we shouldn't spend anything because we don't have the fiscal space. So everything was predicated on the idea that in some way the government would be able to get funds from Europe and it will be able to raise enough taxes or borrow enough from the market in order to be able to spend Greece out of this crisis. Of course, none of those things happened. And as we know, far from getting funds out of Europe, the Europeans said, first of all, we'll bail out our banks with our money who have invested in Greece, and then we'll keep the Greek banking system going. And the last thing we're going to do is actually help Greeks. And all of the debt that Greece has now, which they will, I think I worked out that Greece will not be, even if they grow at 1% or 2% a year for the next century, they will never pay this money off. Before Alex, this debt will still be there when Alex dies and the rest of the editorial board is gone.
Okay, yeah, that's an optimistic view on the future. So if I can sum it up, I would say that at the end of the day, it's all about the social structure that's in place. So my view of seeing that is that fiscal measures and monetary measures are a way of filling up the fuel tank. But by filling up the fuel tank, you're not cranking up the engine. So in capitalism, it's the capitalists that control whether the engine is going to be cranked up or not. So it's not a matter of fiscal space or of monetary stimulus. It's about taking back control of the actual production process. And in capitalism, it's capitalists themselves that will, correct me if I'm wrong, that they will determine investment based on profitability, then investment will drive productivity, and so on and so on. But at the end of the day, it's their choice, and they make that choice based on their account of what profit they're going to make out of it. So anything else, anything that doesn't challenge this major, this major foundation of the capitalist order is more or less bound to fail, isn't it?
Well, yes, of course, we have to study theory because the argument will be that we can restore profits by spending money and so on. So well, we have to analyze why that's not the case, which is a question of looking at whether Marxist theory of Marx's law of profitability is correct or whether it is incorrect. Because if it's incorrect, then capitalism maybe can restore its profits, and then the economies can go forward, and it can restore its profits because governments give it a load of money to invest and employ more people. And I have to say also that I don't think any socialist stands against the idea that we should save workers from this disaster by giving them sufficient money to tide them through this lockdown, and also to ensure that their jobs are restored as best as they can. What I would say is I don't think that the solution to restoring their jobs and getting workers through this crisis is by giving the money to the banks and the companies in order to decide what they do with it. It would be much better if the government intervened and introduced what happened in the Second World War, which was basically to take over control of the capitalist industry, dramatically increase government investment, direct companies to do what they should be doing in order to preserve jobs, and then restore employment as soon as possible once the pandemic lockdowns are over, by having control and ownership of major sectors of the economy, and particularly the banks. I cannot think of any better reason. Three things should be happening. We should be taking over all the banks. I mean, the banks are a disgrace in their ability to help people in this crisis. They've been a disgrace for the last 10 years or longer. The Greek banks, for example, are completely useless and bust. They have huge bad loans because there's so many companies in Greece that can't pay their loans. The banks, to some extent, even when they're state-owned, have no control by the workers involved or a planning mechanism. So that's one thing. And the big industries, why do we not have public ownership of a company like Amazon, which is making billions out of this lockdown, and it's controlled by a few individuals who are making, I think it was claimed that they were making $10,000 a second. This company should be a publicly owned company, and companies like this should be under the control of the people and democratic governments, so that we can direct investment to where it's needed and not just to restore the status quo again. And that's the issue. We're not opposed to helping workers and waiting for capitalism to collapse. I usually get criticized that by Keynesian economists who say we need action, not for you Marxists to stand around doing nothing and waiting for capitalism to collapse. Of course not. We must preserve jobs and conditions of workers, but they won't be preserved, and their wages won't be preserved, and they won't be improved. And all those public health workers who are trying to save lives now, being paid absolutely nothing, and having been denigrated for 10 years, and having their wages held down, that situation cannot continue in the future. So one of the big demands as socialists we must make in the movement is that we must have a proper public health system, publicly funded and organised by workers, and the rest of essential public services. That suddenly, I have found out, I don't know if you've noticed, that garbage collectors, cleaners, delivery drivers, health workers are very essential to our lives, and without them the world stops. Advertising executives, bankers, financial executives and traders on the stock market are totally unproductive, and if they all drop dead tomorrow from the virus, it wouldn't change anything in the economy. And that's a lesson that we can learn from this pandemic.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and I have to admit that during this during the past month, or anyway the last days and so on, it's not only leftists or Marxists that make that kind of that point. In some cases, it's also conservative politicians that actually come to the point to admit that, yeah, without, as you said, without delivery drivers, without nurses, without people, as they call it, people on the front line, we wouldn't be able to sustain this, this situation. So my question here is, isn't that a really favorable ground for the left to promote its cause? And I mean, I cannot help but, bring in mind this, the punchline of, the infamous punchline of Margaret Thatcher, who said that there's no such thing as society, only individuals, only to be rebutted after 40 years by Boris Johnson, a prime minister of, of the same party, who said that, all those frontline people and all this, the solidarity that British people have been showing one to the other they have proven that society does exist.
Yeah.
So isn't there, doesn't the current crisis give us, in a way, a weapon to fight from, a better position when this is all over, and we hope it's over?
I think you're right, Alex. I think there's going to be a battle here between the capitalist class and their strategists who want to return to where things were before without any changes, and they hope that they can continue to do that. It's going to be very difficult for them. And also the fact that most people will recognize now that you have to have a proper public health system. This has been sort of denied for the last period. We can have just enough basic health system to keep costs down. That's not going to be an argument. It's going to be very convincing if the governments of the world start pushing that line after this pandemic is over and the lockdown has been removed. To argue, well, we just go back with no beds, no ICUs, no proper facilities in the hospitals. That's going to be difficult to argue. I just noticed somebody sent me a note saying the other day that Dominic Raab, who is the Foreign Secretary in the UK government, has been praising the NHS as a marvellous institution. And yet he wrote a book with the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, about 5 years ago, in which he said the NHS was a monolith and needed to be broken up and privatised. That is the real attitude of these people. But now, of course, they have to hypocritically say the opposite, because if they didn't, then there will be an outcry in the way in which the health service has been attacked in the past period. So it is an opportunity for the left to fight for better public services, which is, I think, one of the big demands. And how do we get public services that are better and sustained? It requires the ability of governments to be able to control the resources of the economy. The two things come together. But there will be a fight, because I think the governments of the West, so-called Europe or Japan and others, will try to reverse all the spending that's taken place. They see it as short term. They will try to track it back, and certainly not to expand it with a better public system and so on. They won't want that. I mean, I hear talk about, well, this is an opportunity and maybe the governments will now see the need for more public investment and so on. Well, I'm not so sure about that. I think that once this pandemic and slump is over, then they will try to revert to where they were before. They won't find it easy this time, but that will be the attempt. So there will be an opportunity for those of us in the labour movement to struggle for better conditions, which may lead to an opening up in the minds of many other people that the old way, the so-called neoliberal way, to use the academic term, can no longer be applied in the next 10 years.
So since we're talking about the day after, if I can call it that, I would like to, take a detour now that we're heading towards the end of what is a really vivid discussion. I want to take a step back and revisit the theme of fragmentation that we talked about at the start. But this time I want us to discuss on the economic, but mainly on the political aspects of that. Now, it's sure that the current pandemic has shown the incompetence, but also the unwillingness of the US to lead a global response. At the same time, the same thing can also be said for the EU, apparently, or Germany as the hegemonic force inside the EU. You know, all these instances where medical equipment was traveling from country to country and was withheld in airports. And I guess that has nothing to do with the ideal of the European Union, or maybe that's just the ideal of the European Union in practice. But anyway, that's a different story. What I wanted to touch upon is, what about China in that context? Now, I know that you have kind of a unique stance against China. I think you're the only one among even mainstream Keynesians or Marxist economists that you view China as what you call a weird beast, not socialist by any account.
Not a very scientific definition, but
yeah. Anyway, but I mean, it conveys a meaning, which is that it's a state, an economy neither socialist, but in no account a socialist economy, but it's also not a capitalist economy. Now, obviously, analyzing China might need a long time. What I want from you is a comment on whether you see from the current crisis an opportunity for China, or in general, let's say, do you see the case of a new world hegemony under China this time in the backdrop of the US decline? Or do you think that we're still very far from that?
Well, I think a Marxist economist would look at the most important criterion to begin with to analyze whether a country is hegemonic or in the position to become a hegemonic, and that is, what is the level of productivity per person in China? What is the level of technological development in China relative to the current hegemonic in power, which is the US primarily on a world scale, or Germany in Europe? And clearly, the level of productivity per person in China is still way, way behind what it is in the US or in Germany, something like 1/3. Sure, if you go back 25 years, it was way smaller than that. We've seen a dramatic improvement both in the level of national output, in the level of living standards for the mass of the population in China, not all, but a mass of them, and a sharp increase in productivity, which is a product of the industrialization of China that we've seen over the last period, particularly in the last 30 years, and the use and the increase in the technological level and superiority for that, but they're still behind. But they are catching up every day, leaving aside this pandemic for the moment. The narrowing of the gap technologically between that and the US and the G7 economies has been taking place. And that is the big worry for US imperialism. They see a new economic rival on a world scale, not just on trade, which has already happened, or on manufacturing goods using cheap labor and new factories, but now in the areas of technology, 5G, all kinds of other things which threaten the whole position of the US superiority on technology. So economically, US has been in relative decline. It grows, but it's in relative decline both to China, for that matter, to some extent with Germany and Japan. So it's been in relative decline for a long time, but now it faces a real rival in the case of China, which threatens its economic and manufacturing and trading power in the world. But where US still has dominance, apart from the fact that China hasn't caught up with the US yet, where it still has dominance is political. It controls all the political international agencies that matter, the IMF, the UN, World Bank, the International Labour Organization, World Trade Organization, and Trump can close them down or open them up as he feels. Those are things that are still under the control of the US, along with its G7 allies, but particularly the US. And it also has financial power. It is still the most important financial center in the world, where capital flows are dominated by the big financial institutions in New York and to some extent in London, and they operate and still have a grip. And the US dollar is still the main means of transaction and store of wealth. It's the main reserve currency. The Chinese yuan is nowhere in that position. It's getting stronger with its export of capital into Africa, into Asia. The yuan is becoming more important, but it's still the US dollar is the supreme currency. And finally, US has overwhelming military superiority and power. It spends more. Its armies are bigger than all the rest of the other countries' armies and spending put together. So the US dominates in those areas, which makes an imperialist hegemony very far from being China. China may make some progress technologically, trade-wise, but in those other areas, it's still behind. Now, that is going to come into also perhaps competition over the next generation, 20, 30 years. China will continue, in my view, to grow faster than the US. It will continue to expand in its influence in other parts of the world. And it will be in a position where it becomes be able to threaten the US in these other areas, because the US is trying to surround China militarily with all its allies. It's trying to provoke it all the time. It wants to hold it down. It wants to cut it down to the barest minimum. And ideally, it would like China to capitulate, open up its economy to the influx of US and European and Japanese capital in a complete free market way, as happens in other countries, and therefore turn itself into another Brazil or another India and so on. So far, the Chinese regime has resisted that, although I think it's probably split about whether it wants to go down the capitalist road or stay with state control of the vast majority of industry and so on. And that remains to be seen over the next few years. This is a long discussion. But as you said, Alex, at the beginning, I don't think China is a socialist country. It is not. It is a dictatorship. It's an authoritarian regime. There are no elections. There's no, workers can organize things at a local level. They can strike, they can do all sorts of protests, but they have no control over the government and over the planning system of China. And if you step out of line, like if you're a Muslim Uyghur, then you're likely to end up in a concentration camp. If you've got a religious belief and you want to operate like a sect, you're also likely to get into trouble. So this is no democratic socialist operation. On the other hand, it is not a free-for-all capitalist system where the big combines of capitalism operate untrammeled, quite the reverse. The state controls what they do, and most of the key parts of the Chinese economy are state-owned and controlled by the leadership and the party and the state machine, and they try to plan it in that direction. And because they can do that, they can get out of these things like these pandemics a hell of a sight quicker than we will see in the West. And that's the point that I would make. So I think it's not decided which way China is going to go. And it's not decided whether the US will be able to hold its position of hegemony right through the 21st century. Clearly the trends are there. Therefore, the intensity of a struggle between China and the US is going to get worse, particularly if the West's economies are not working well, because that will increase the intensity of the US to do something about China, to blame it for everything, to control it, and to try and reduce its impact and defeat it if it can, if economically probably rather than militarily.
So, yeah, according to your view, then, that means that this is probably the major theme of the 21st century, that rivalry, and whether China will be able to overcome the US, or the US will reassert its dominance over the world capitalist system.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely for the US to maintain that position of outright dominance. So it's going to be a struggle. And just on a secondary point, Alex, at a lower level, if you like, in the regional level, the ability of Germany, or the Franco-German leadership of the European Union and the Eurozone in particular, to hold that together over the next 10 or 20 years is much shorter time. The pandemic is creating fissures in the Eurozone, which may not allow it to survive the Euro in the current form, because of the unwillingness and inability of the hegemonic powers to say, well, we're supposed to be our European Union and cooperate, as you say, and we're supposed to help the countries that are in difficult, so we all merge and converge together. Quite the opposite. The system is based not on convergence of production, of living standards and so on. It's based on the weaker capitalist economies within the Eurozone towing the line to the richer, stronger capitalist economies in the north part of the Eurozone. That's held together when all economies are growing. But since the Great Recession of 2008 and now this, the fissures between those two halves of the Eurozone could reach breaking point. So we could see capitalism never works in a cooperative way indefinitely. Marx used to say, well, capitalists are brothers against the labour movement, but they're feuding thieves against each other, particularly when there's not enough to go around. And that's the situation which increasingly is going to be the problem for the Eurozone and German hegemony.
Yeah. Well, I think that, since today is the birthday of Lenin, it's 150 years after the birth of Lenin.
That's true,
And a little bit more than a century ago, there was a discussion inside the labor movement about whether the rise of the imperialist countries will end up in creating what Kautsky was calling the global governance. Mm-hmm. And Lenin was in complete disagreement with that view, saying that there's no way that the capitalist states can end up in a cooperative environment. It's in the nature of capitalism to create and revive those rivalries from time to time. And I think that if both Lenin and Kautsky would live today, then there would be no question between them as to who was right and who was wrong.
Yes.
So if
we're going to have a union of the world, it's not going to happen on a capitalist basis. That was the key point here.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And I guess that it's also quite, we can be sure that we're already in the grounds of what theorists like Fernand Braudel or Giovanni Arrighi or Minky Lee, Chinese theorists, what they call the era of systemic chaos, where the older hegemonic force is on the decline, but there's no hegemonic force arising yet. So that means that we can expect all sorts of things to happen in the next years, isn't it? We can expect even at the global level.
The 1920s and 30s were like that, where Britain was no longer the hegemonic power, but the US did not replace it or was not prepared to replace it immediately. So you had convulsions and violence, the development of fascism, the struggles during the Great Depression. That is a real danger that we could experience over the next 10 or 15 years. Different form now, because of course it's global. It's not just a question of the battle in Europe. The European Union was supposedly to solve the issues of what happened in the 30s. It will never happen again, wars in Europe. And apart from the Balkans, at least that has had some result. Now it is a global situation, global rivalry, with weaponry that we've never had before, nuclear weaponry which can annihilate the human race. That's why capitalism, unless it's completely controlled by lunatic fascists, that's a possibility, it would seem. But if it isn't, then they will avoid war at all costs, because that's the end of the capitalist system. But short of accidents, or short of, we're going to get a very intense rivalry of all kinds of skirmishes and proxy wars and trade battles. The idea of globalization and cooperation on the part of capitalism to develop the world's productive resources is over, I think, for a generation. We're now going to be in a much more difficult, competitive and volatile situation as a result of failure of capitalism to deal with the crisis that we saw in the early part of the first decade of this century, and now with this pandemic and possible pandemics to come. And don't forget, I would say, Alex, don't forget, we still have not, capitalism has totally failed to deal with the growing problem of climate change and global warming. One of the features of the pandemic has been how fantastically clean the air has got around the world, with all fossil fuel industries closed down and transport closed down. Yet, if you also look at the figures only today, the world is heading for a record heat level temperature in 2020, outcoming 2019, which is bad enough. So the process of global warming continues despite this short break from the disaster that fossil fuel industries created.
Yeah. So if I was to sum it all up, I would say that basically it's a crazy world out there, but we somehow must find the strength to fight for the cause of the labor movement and for the improvement of our lives at the last instance, because this is what it's all about, improving our own living standards and, you know, making our lives, our own lives better. So if I may say one more thing about that, I must say that there was one particular quote from a post that you wrote, I think it was a couple of days ago, named The War Economy, where you said that the solution lies in a society that is based on the skills and the resources of the working people. So to come back to the pandemic has shown that at the end of the day, it's not about, as you said, it's not about managers or hedge fund people and things like that. It's about the skills and the resources of the doctors, the nurses, the delivery drivers, but also about, I mean, people that are sitting in front of their computer, they're working from home and they're keeping vital services alive at the moment. So to take control of the economy is not just, it's not just a demand based on, you know, some kind of universal justice principle. It's also based on the fact that, let's say, the capacity or the ability is in place. So the world is actually turning, it keeps turning because there are working people that keep it turning, and not because there are capitalists that are creating wealth or that they are, you know, pulling the strings of the society. It all comes down to working people putting their skills and expertise, whatever that is, to keep our society going and satisfy the most basic of needs, but not only the most basic of needs, but in general, make our lives better.
And with it's the power of labor. Capitalism is nothing without the power of labor. If labor is united and it wants to use its power to produce things, create things, and keep things going, then capitalism is nothing. They are tiny, we are many.
Yeah, totally agree on that. So thank you very much, Michael, for this discussion. It has been really great. I hope that we managed to narrow the range of things that we discussed. We touched upon several topics, but yeah, I hope that it will be easy for people to follow, and it's not just us, jumping from one subject to the other. I think that there was definitely a structure there, and your presentation really helped. But in any case, I must say, now I'm speaking for myself, that I've only touched, let's say, 10% of what I wanted to discuss with you every time I read your blog.
Well, we can
your
do it again.
books.
We can do something else again.
Yeah, I think we definitely need the part 2. But anyway, the part 1 has been really, really good, and I'm sure that a lot of people will find that really insightful and helpful. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and let's hope that we'll have the chance in the future to continue from where we left it today.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye, Michael.
Bye.